Hey guys, how you going? My name is Dom and today I'm going to be showing you how to create a custom select menu using HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Okay, so it's going to look like this. We've got these 6 options to choose from, and right now it's set up to be a multiple select, but you can set it up to be a single select if you want, and we're going to be having a look at those two different types. But right now I can select something like HTML, SQL and Python, and it's going to look like that. So the way it works is basically behind the scenes there is a hidden select input field. Okay, so these buttons just correlate to these options, and then when you press submit, it is going to submit them to the server side. Okay, so right now I'm using PHP as my example, and we can see that we've got the language property in the post array, and we've got HTML, Python and SQL. If you are using a different server side, we can just prove that it's working by going to the network tab right up here, and we can see inside the request that the browser did in fact send through on the bottom here the 3 values for the language form name. Okay, so let's go inside this tab right here and begin from scratch to create what I just showed you. Now also keep in mind that the source code for this is going to be linked down below if you want to download and follow along. Okay, so to start it off, let's go inside the HTML, and we've got this. So I've linked up a main.css and a main.javascript, which are both currently empty. Okay, so the first step here is going to be to write out the HTML for the custom select. Okay, so right here we're going to make a new div with a class of select, and then inside here we can make a couple of more divs. We can just say select underscore underscore item with HTML inside here. So now you just want to specify each one of your options. Okay, now keep in mind that all this stuff right here is actually going to be generated by the JavaScript later on, but we're just going to be specifying here for now just so we can actually style them using CSS and we can preview our style changes. Okay, so let's just say CSS here and then JavaScript just for an example. Okay, so saving this and going inside the browser, we have something like this. Okay, so now let's basically use CSS to convert this right here into this right here. So going inside the CSS file, we're going to firstly just target the class of select. So for the main container, we're going to use a display of grid. This will allow us to create that that column and row setup. Okay, so we can then say grid-template-columns, then we can say repeat 3 at 1 fr. So in this case here, it's basically just saying that I want 3 columns in my grid of an equal width. Okay, then we can just say a maximum width of 300 px. Now you can of course make these numbers whatever you like. If you want 4 per line, you can do that, whatever you want really, and the same goes for the maximum width. Okay, we're going to give this a grid gap of 1 px also, just to put some space between each one of our items. Save this, go back in the browser, and we have something like this. As we can see, we've got the grid working perfectly fine. Now as you add more elements to your select list, this is going to increase and go down below. But anyway, if we go back in the CSS, we can now style up each individual select item. We can say a class of select underscore underscore item. We can say a padding of 10 px, a cursor of pointer to indicate to the user that you can actually click on these items. We can say a font family of Hebo and then sans serif. That's just my font choice. We can say a text align of center, a border dash radius here of 3 px, a background of just a light gray, and lastly a transition of background at 0.1 seconds. Okay, so we now just want to say, once we have the select item, we need to basically create a different class here to style it when it's actually selected. So the background here is going to change, and it's going to take 0.1 seconds to change when the user clicks on the select item. So the JavaScript is basically going to add the class here of select item dash dash selected, and this will be the changes to the visual of that item when, of course, the user decides to choose that item. Hope that made sense. I kind of went around in circles there, but basically this class is the selected state. And we're going to say here a background of 009578 and a color of white. Okay, so now it's going to take 0.1 seconds for the background to change, giving us a nice smooth transition when the user clicks on those items. So saving this here, going back inside the browser, and we have something like this. So if I was to now go inside here and sort of pretend to click on CSS, for example, we can say dash dash selected, press enter, and we have our transition for that selected state. So we are done with the CSS for the custom select. Okay, so now let's use JavaScript to tie everything together. Okay, so going back inside the text editor, the way it's going to work is you're going to have your HTML form just like this, and then inside your form you're going to specify your select element. So this right here isn't going to change. So specify your name. We can just say language, for example, okay, or language square brackets if you're using PHP, if not language, but doesn't matter. This is going to be your name. Now basically the JavaScript code which we're going to write is going to grab your select right here, and then it's going to hide it behind the scenes and also create one of our fancy select divs down here on top of your original select. Okay, so to achieve that, give this a class of custom-select. That way the JavaScript knows which select elements to apply that change to. Okay, inside here we're also going to say multiple. I'm going to be showing you, of course, how to make this single item only towards the end of the video, but for now let's make this multiple. Inside your select, specify your options as per normal. So I'll just copy and paste my existing ones right here for each language. Okay, so of course right here you're going to have your own options to specify. Okay, now we've got our select element. So now, like I said earlier, we're going to use JavaScript to convert this right here into our fancy div right down below. So with that being said, let's just comment out our div. That way it doesn't interfere with our code. Alright, so going inside the JavaScript right here, we're going to be using classes to create this, this solution. So we're going to say class right here, and we're going to say custom select. It's going to take through a constructor, which then takes in the original select element. Okay, so if you're not too sure what classes are, I've got a whole video dedicated to them if you want to check that one out before continuing. But basically, we're going to be creating a new instance of this class for every single original select element on the page. In this case here, we've only got the one. Okay, so down here, we're going to say document.query selector all, then say .custom-select, obviously the class, which I referenced down below inside here. There we go. For each custom select, we're going to say .for each, then we're going to grab the select element. Then we're going to say new custom select and pass through the select element right there. Okay, so we've got this code set up inside the constructor. For every single select element, we're going to firstly hold a reference to the original select element. So I'm just going to say here, this.original select element is equal to original select element. You know what? Let's just make this original select. It's going to make it a lot easier to say in the future. So we've got a reference to the original select element. Then we're going to say this.root is equal to document.createElement, pass through a div. You know what? Let's call this one custom select. Okay, so got the original and then the custom, which gets created using JavaScript. we're now going to say this.customSelect.classList.add and add here the class of select. Okay, so we've basically, using these two lines, we've created our div with a class of select down here. So let's add this to the HTML or to the document. Okay, so go down here, this.originalSelect.insertAdjacent HTML, insert adjacent element. Gonna pass through here after end, then say this.customSelect. So basically, after the end of our original select right up here, we're gonna insert the div right below after the end of it. So if I save this JavaScript code, go back in the browser, we've got our multi-select right here, but also in the console we can see that we've got our div with a class of select generated using the JavaScript code. So now essentially we need to loop through every single option here and then create one of these for each one. Okay, so when I say one of these, I refer to these divs with a class of select item. So going back inside the JavaScript, we're going to be doing this by going up here in the constructor, and we're going to be saying basically this.originalSelect.querySelectorAll. Let's select every single option element. Then we're going to say for each option element, okay, right inside here, we're going to run this function. So we're going to firstly be saying const item element is equal to document.createElement, then pass through here the div. So basically creating a new div, one of these down here for every single option. So these divs must have a class. So we can say item element.class list.add. Let's give this a class of select __ item. Let's also say item element.text content equal to the option element text content, basically just copying what's inside the option inside the div. Okay. Then lastly, we can just say this.customSelect.appendChild. Let's append the item to our custom select container. If I save this here, go back in the browser, we have all of this right here generated using the JavaScript. As we can see, our old version is still commented out. Okay, now we've got our, our select or custom select generated. The next step is going to be to actually make it work when you click on these buttons. So going back inside the JavaScript, we're going to be specifying two methods below the constructor. One is called _select. It's going to take through an item element. So basically an item element refers to one of your divs inside here. Take through one of those. And a second one called deselect, also taking through the item element which you want to deselect. Okay. Now I've used an underscore here for these method names just to indicate that it should be used as a private method, but you can call both of these just simply, select and deselect if you want to, but I'm going to keep mine as underscore, then select and deselect. Anyway, going back up here in the constructor, let's call both of these select and deselect. So inside our option element query selector loop, let's go down here and we're going to say item element dot add event listener. So we're going to be saying right up here, click. So when the user clicks on your item, then we're going to run this function. So this function here is going to check if your item is currently selected. So we're going to say right up here, if item element dot class list dot contains, if it contains our fancy class of select __ item dash selected. So if it contains our fancy, background and color class right up here, then we're going to consider it to be selected. We're going to say this.deselect, then pass through the item element. Okay, so if it isn't, if it's not currently selected, then we're going to say this.select and then pass through the item element, giving us a simple toggle. Also keep in mind that the select method is going to add this class, which effectively makes all of this work. So we've got our select and our deselect and select toggle. So now when I click on this CSS, for example, I expect this to be highlighted right up here in our original select. if I click on JavaScript, I expect now JavaScript to be highlighted as well. Okay, so let's make this work. Let's go inside the select method. The first step here is going to be to grab the index of the item which you are passing in. Okay, so I'm going to say const index is equal to array.from, then pass through here this dot custom select, okay, dot children, then say dot index of, then pass through the item element. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm creating an array from each one of our custom select items. So basically an array of all of these right here. So 1, 2, and then 3. Okay. Then I'm saying get me the index of the one you pass in. So if I pass in CSS, for example, the index is going to be 0, 1, 2. It's going to be 1. So index 1 for CSS as an example. Okay, so now I've got that index. The index down here matches up with the index right up here. So of course 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. So index 1 for CSS, we're going to be setting the selected property or the selected attribute here to be true. There we go. So now going back in the JavaScript, going to say right down here, we're going to say this dot original select dot query selector all. We're going to grab every single option, okay? Then we're going to say get me the option at that index of 1, for example, in the case of CSS. Then we're going to say dot selected is equal to dot selected is equal to true. Okay? It's going to add that selected attribute to our CSS in the case we pass in CSS. Okay? Cool. Then we're going to add that fancy class to our div to make it look nice. So up here or down here, we can say item element which we pass in dot class list dot add. Let's give this the class of our our select item dash dash selected. I can save this now and go back inside the browser, click on CSS. We have our selected attribute set on that index of 1 and our background color. Let's choose JavaScript. Boom, we got 2, index 2, and then our background color right there. So it's all working beautifully. Okay, now what about the deselect? If I go back inside here, for the deselect, we're simply just going to do the exact same thing here, but in reverse. So let's copy the exact same code. This time we're going to say dot selected is equal to false. Okay, then say class list dot remove the selected class. So save this back in the browser. Click on CSS, for example, and we can see if I click on HTML again, it goes away. Same goes for CSS and Python, and it's all working beautifully. So we can see where it's going, right? So we're going to be hiding this select element behind the scenes. Obviously the user can't manually select them like this, but we're going to hide it behind the scenes and make this thing do all the work. Okay, now there's a slight problem with this, and that is that when the page first loads up, if I was to select, for example, CSS by default, okay, like this, back in the browser, it's selected here on page load, but not down here. So to fix that, if we go back inside the JavaScript, let's say right up here inside our option query selector, if we say if the option element dot is selected, okay, we can just say this dot select, and we can manually call our select method and pass through the item element. Okay, so we're almost done. Save this back in the browser. CSS is now selected by default when the page first loads up. There we go. Now let's hide our multi-select. Back inside here, just going to say this dot original select dot style dot display equal to none, just to hide that. Save this back in the browser, and it is gone, but it is still working behind the scenes right up here. Our select is still being, populated with those selected attributes. Okay, cool. So it's basically ready to go, but I haven't yet shown you the single select mode. So for that, to make this a single select only, if we go back inside the HTML, let's remove this multiple flag, and once again, in the case of PHP, remove our square brackets. So we've got a standard single select. I just want to put back our display of none to make this visible. Save this back in the browser. If we don't touch the JavaScript, it's still kind of working. So if I choose HTML, it goes to HTML. It sets that true attribute. If I choose SQL, once again SQL, but obviously you can see right here, basically the one you most recently selected gets that value. So we don't want every single one here to be selected at once. We only want one at a time. So to fix that, if we go back inside the JavaScript, let's go down to our select method. So when you select an element, we're basically going to clear the slate and remove our selected fancy CSS class from every single one. Then run this code down here to make it work as per normal. So between our two lines up here and down here, we're just going to say if this dot select element dot multiple, so if, sorry, this dot original select. If our original select is not a multiple select, okay, so this multiple here just refers to the multiple flag right up here. So if it is not a multiple select, then we're going to say this dot custom select dot query selector all. We're going to grab every single select underscore underscore item from inside here. Then we're going to say for each, so for every single select item, we're going to run this function, and basically this function is going to remove that class. So we can say l.classList.remove and remove the fancy selected class from inside there. So now save this back in the browser. We can see that if I was to now choose HTML, everything else gets, unselected before the actual one gets selected, and we have our nice effect. But you may have saw that just then. If I was to choose CSS, for example, click it again, it goes back to HTML because it's the default. If I choose Kotlin, click it again, back to HTML. So how do we fix this right here? How do we prevent how do we prevent the user from simply unselecting? So to achieve that, back inside the JavaScript, up inside our event listener here, we're going to say for deselect, basically, put an and here, and we're going to say if this dot original select is multiple and it contains the class of selected, then we're going to deselect. So basically, we are only enabling the user to deselect when it is a multiple select field. Okay, so save this back in the browser, click on CSS once it's been selected, and we can't unselect. Remember, the CSS is the default when the page first loads up, so I'll just remove that just to make it a bit easier to understand. So back inside here, HTML, click on HTML again, and it stays. SQL, click it again, it stays. Python, it stays. So that is how to create a custom select using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now guys, you also just want to remove your display of none down here, or at least put it back. That way you have a clean slate without your default select element right there. If today's video helped you out, drop a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.